What is it, that time of year again where we all get excited about Fernando Alonso and Aston Martin? Well, he was certainly quickest today at the beginning of the Saudi Arabian, I was going to say weekend, the 3 days, because this is another Saturday race. And first practice, the first two sessions took place on the Thursday at this, well, can I say rather bland circuit. Super grip, very high speed, lots of blind high-speed S's where it's flat out. They're not even feathering through there. Not my sort of circuit, as I said several times, and several near misses today with drivers just flat out through this blind section and coming across a slower car, middle of the road. A lot of traffic on the radio today, giving drivers gaps, times, positions to cars in front and behind. Everybody very wary of how dodgy this circuit is in that area. Let's just hope, fingers crossed, that we can get through the weekend without any serious incident there, because of course speed differential is the worst thing you can have in Formula One. And when it's a blind corner, a blind series of corners, and when it's a very quick blind series of corners, that is when the problem is at its worst. Anyway, today we got through unscathed, and Fernando Alonso ended up being quickest in the second session, which was the faster of the two. Obviously the track picking up grip, it was the one held under lights, which is what the race is going to be as well. The track was a bit cooler then as well, or considerably cooler. They went out on mediums, generally speaking, initially, just to get the car balance sorted out, and then they put on the softs. And it was Fernando, who just looked really quick. He looked like a qualifying driver. I don't know what's going on. Just brilliant to watch him in the Aston Martin, sparks everywhere, and looking very confident, very organised, very confident. And in a way, perhaps going a little bit quicker on an untimed session at the beginning of a weekend than you might get a Max doing these days, or certainly a Lewis Hamilton. I think that's a little bit of it, but Fernando obviously feeling at one with the car, as Max would say, and looking forward to a good weekend at Aston Martin. Big news at Aston Martin, of course, is that Bob Bell has now joined as a senior executive officer in charge of the technical side of the team. Really good move, I think, by Aston Martin there to hire Bob Bell. He was formerly at Renault, advising, consulting a little bit at Alpine. Before that, of course, big time at Renault and then at McLaren. And maybe Martin Whitmarsh got to know Bob then from his McLaren days as well. So Bob has been a little bit on the sidelines, but I think this is a great move to get him in there. And what a great weekend for him to start work with the team. The car appears to be pretty much right there. In terms of a quick performance lap, second quickest George Russell, again a little bit like Fernando with that lap, absolutely on the edge. Not the sort of lap you're going to see Lewis doing in an untimed practice going into Saudi Arabia, but enough for him to be P2 ahead of Max Verstappen, who at 29.1, 3 tenths away from Fernando. You could press a panic button. I'm not going to press one because it looked to me as if Max he wasn't 100% happy with the car straight out of the box, so they're working a little bit on that. And there was a lot of traffic. There is a lot of traffic in Saudi Arabia, unbelievably, given the length of the straights and everything else. There is a lot of traffic. It does bunch them up. And Max certainly being very, very careful in traffic, and careful also in the way he was approaching the lap as well. Obviously conscious that the circuit is going to pick up grip. So I don't think we should read too much into Max being only P3. And we'll get on in a second with what he did with fuel in the car at the back end of that FP2. Just to go through the other times in that session. Charles Leclerc, P4 for Ferrari. Sergio Perez, he looked very good, I thought, in the Red Bull, P5. Lance Stroll, underlining the drivability of the Aston Martin, P6. And Carlos Sainz, who's been under the weather, but was driving the other day. He didn't do any of his normal media or public appearances, but driving very well in the car and looking very good, actually, on a difficult circuit, relatively difficult circuit, or hard circuit for the drivers physically because of this high level of grip. And just to reflect on that, you would imagine because of the high level of grip, it should bring the opposition a little bit closer to Red Bull. In theory, that's a very general, easy statement to make, but in theory, that's what should happen. And also, a lot of it is going to be about top speed and trading off wing for downforce and therefore grip. And if you've got a high level of grip, that isn't a bad baseline. It's going to help the opposition more than it's going to help Red Bull. I think that's what Max was possibly trying to say after the Bahrain Grand Prix. And he certainly had a point there. It's not going to have the same margin, I think, the Red Bull RB20 around here. Still looks like a really good racing car, though. Then Lewis Hamilton, Pierre Gasly, and Oscar Piastri, the quicker of the two McLaren drivers, in the top 10 in terms of lap times on the soft tyres. But the heart of Thursday was when they put on the medium, or some of them stayed on the soft, and did the fuel runs at the back end of FP2. And this was really what this whole day was all about. And this is the real pointer we're going to have for the for the 2 days ahead, certainly going into the race anyway. Look at Max Verstappen's run: 34.2, 34.3, 33.9, 34.0, 34.0, 33.9, 33.7 on the medium tyre. And it was interesting, after about 3 laps, Max went out a little bit later than normal. Fernando right on the case, out early, and also his team, Max's teammate Sergio Perez, very organised as well, his side of the garage today. Fernando doing mid 34s basically, and I thought it was interesting after a couple of laps that they were giving Max the average time that Fernando had been doing as a sort of benchmark for today. This is what we need to know. Forget about everybody else, sort of thing. But you can see there how good the RB20 looks with fuel in the car. And guess what? It's probably running more fuel than the Aston anyway at this point. I mean, the Aston obviously had quite a lot of fuel in. It's a long run there, but knowing Red Bull, they probably had a lot of fuel in the car there. So the RB20 looks really good there. Look at Sergio Perez on the other side of the table there, the far end of the table. Look how many laps he did and how consistent he was today. In many ways, that was the most impressive of all the long runs we saw today. So if you're a betting man, I would have thought, a betting person, Sergio Perez might be a good guy to have a look at the odds for this weekend. Charles Leclerc on the soft, Carlos Sainz in the other Ferrari on the medium. And although Carlos, as I say, didn't feel that well, I mean, very good little run by Carlos there. And interesting to see, I've put the two together there, interesting to see how the soft and the medium compare. The soft, pretty good in terms of not having much degradation, high grip, everything else. And you see Charles there doing a 34.3, 34.2 towards the end of the run. And Carlos Sainz doing 34.1s, just getting quicker and quicker. I suppose just sort of getting adrenaline there and getting over that slight bug that he's got. So an interesting comparison. I think that means that the medium tyre is pretty good. It also means that the soft tyre doesn't degrade very much. So we'll probably see a good use of the soft tyre going into the race, and how many new sets they have going into the race will be pretty critical, I guess, into the strategies. George Russell went out relatively late. He was complaining quite a lot about how unstable the car was at high speed. We'll get on to that again in a second, because the Mercedes much more competitive in a straight line here, it would appear, than at Bahrain, and I guess that means they're running relatively less downforce, and we saw the upshot of that with George saying how unstable the car felt in medium and high speed corners, and Lewis Hamilton kind of backing that up as again. A bit of a scrappy day for Lewis Hamilton. Didn't look very good. Just didn't get good runs in terms of traffic. There was traffic all the time, and he never looked convincingly quick, sort of George Russell white knuckle quick. And of course there was an interesting dynamic this afternoon between Lewis and George. George using every opportunity he could to say how unstable the car was at the rear on the high and medium speed corners. And Lewis, well, giving us a snapshot of where Lewis is in 2024, obviously not prepared to put everything on the line when he's got high-speed oversteer. He had a massive moment in the middle of the S's as it was. Very nice car control, wonderful balance. Had to go into the runoff area and the lap was gone, of course, but it was lovely to watch in slow-mo anyway. But that sort of thing about George, yeah, well, I've got this unstable rear, but I'm nonetheless going to go for it, and I got it, and I got the lap time. And then there's Lewis being much more circumspect, as you would expect of a 7-times world champion. Meanwhile, Lando Norris was out on the hard tyre for McLaren Mercedes. 36.4, 34.8, 34.7, 34.9, 34.4, 34.1. So the hard tyre coming in quite nicely as well, and ending up with a 34.1 for Lando, which is sort of Carlos Sainz on the medium. So the hard tyre doesn't look too bad either. Let's have a look now at the speed trap after FP1. When the track, it was an earlier session, it was hotter as well, but you can see there the usual suspects. Daniel Ricciardo in the RBR, was it Visa Cash App car, 33.9, did that speed through the track quite early in the session. And you can see there the Mercedes, Lewis Hamilton and George Russell right up there, 3.35, George Russell 33.4, commensurate with the Red Bulls, exactly the same sort of speeds. Fernando Alonso a shade away, but very quick in a straight line. And the other significant thing are the two McLarens, which don't appear to be any different from Bahrain in terms of how competitive they are with the key front runners. So whereas after FP1 it was clear that Mercedes have definitely become more competitive in a straight line with the downforce setup they've got, McLaren basically kind of sticking with where they are, and also Ferrari possibly dropping back a little bit as well with downforce on the car. Maybe they were going to take some out as well. So let's have a look at what they did through the trap in FP2 to see how they compared. The Haas Ferraris, again, really quick, as they were in Bahrain, and indeed as they were in FP1. Kevin Magnussen 3.33 in FP1, Nico Hülkenberg right at the top there. These are rounded out in terms of decimal places, and you can see how close it is, really. But nonetheless, there is an order, and that order is worth looking at in terms of changes from one session to another. So Mercedes staying with the downforce settings, George Russell right on the edge in terms of grip level and the balance that he needs through medium to high speed corners. But if you can have any driver get the maximum from the car in that situation in untimed practice, it's going to be George Russell. Red Bull 3.34 right there as they were this morning, making no changes there, looking to be very quick in every department as ever, as quick as they need to be in a straight. They've probably got a little bit of margin there to take wing out of the car if they need to. I doubt that they will. Kevin Magnussen backing up Nico Hülkenberg. Fernando Alonso in the game as well. Aston Martin looking pretty good. Lance Stroll surprisingly not as quick in a straight line, but that's probably a traffic thing more than anything else. And Yuki Tsunoda on this occasion underlying the speed of that Visa Cash App Red Bull RBR car. What a mouthful that is. Lewis Hamilton, a desultory sort of mid time there, what you'd expect, not quite as quick as George. Whether that's set up, whether that's Lewis running a little bit more wing. I mean, he was quite quick in FP1 through the speed trap and lost 3 or 4 kilometres, so possibly they've given him a little bit more wing in FP2. Daniel Ricciardo still 3.31. And let's just look there, Ferrari still not very quick in a straight line. That will not be comforting news for them when they look at those times tonight and they dissect them, and nor are McLaren either. So the trend's more or less the same, no real changes. We did see some quite fundamental changes from Friday to Saturday in Bahrain, but nothing between the two sessions at Saudi Arabia. So the story of the day then were these long runs at the back end of FP2, how impressive Max was with his times and his consistency, and how well backed up he was by Sergio Perez this afternoon as well, or this evening. Really, really good run by both drivers in the RB20. Bad news for everybody else. Bad news for anybody that might be thinking, wow, it's going to be much closer. Having said that, Fernando Alonso right out there in the Aston Martin looking good. George Russell, unbelievably spectacular in the Mercedes, right on the edge, eye-wateringly so, as indeed he was in Bahrain. And Ferrari too, in pretty good shape, running 2 different compounds, which is always a good sign of a team on top of things and starting to get their homework properly put together. So that was Thursday. Let's have a look and see what happens as we go into Friday, FP3. There'll be more full tanks running. We'll be making a note of those, of course. And then we go into qualifying. How important is qualifying in Saudi Arabia? Yeah, like everywhere, it is important, but there are a lot of DRS zones here. It's not impossible to overtake, so it's not quite as critical as it was, say, at Bahrain and will be at other circuits this year. But nonetheless, it'll be a very good pointer to where we're going. My gut feeling is that over one lap here, Max probably is going to be right there, but if he has any sorts of issues, he's not going to be taking any sort of risk, whereas a George Russell and maybe even a Fernando in his current state are going to be out there on the edge, potentially looking at a pole. And don't forget Sergio Perez, who's looking very good right now as we go into the sharp end of the Saudi Arabian weekend. See you tomorrow for FP3 and qualifying.
I'm dancing till the sun comes up. I don't care what's in my cup. Tonight I'm doing what I want. What